Hello and welcome to the First Right Podcast, your weekly dose of conservative news brought to you by Restoration of America. I'm your host, Hayden Ludwig, Research Director for Restoration News. Be sure to check out our work at restoration-news.com. Today we're joined by Bill Robinson, an award-winning journalist writing for Newsmax and the Epoch Times, to explore the epidemic of woke schools and the transgender activists trying to steal your kids. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, sir. You're a great American.
Likewise. In the opener, we called the transgender movement's influence in our schools an epidemic. But am I putting that too strongly, or how do you see it?
No, I think you're putting it exactly right. If anything, you might be not aggressive enough about that. This transgender indoctrination, and that's even being too soft. It's more like what the Chinese Communist Party is doing to the Uyghurs. These are prison camps of the mind, these public schools, all across the country. So I know a lot about what's happening in North Carolina schools. And, it seems to be happening. I'm finding out about what's happening in Texas schools because I'm writing a new series of columns for the Epoch Times. And I've been down there interviewing people in Texas, and it's the same darn things. And it's a multilateral pincer movement on our children. And it starts very young. They started with the pronoun pins. It starts, well, not innocuously enough, but compared to all the other ways in which they're harming our children, pronoun pins are probably the least harmful, but still harmful. And they were starting around 7, 8, 9, 10, and now they're starting in 3rd and 4th grade. And
so when you say pronoun pins, you mean an actual pin with he or she on it?
Yes. Well, with Z or Zer or one of the other insane, unintelligible pronouns that they've manufactured. I mean, the whole thing is beyond belief. It beggars belief. It's the theater of the absurd. So they have these new pronoun pins, and they might be something like she, her. But they're being given to little boys. She, her are not given to the appropriate sex of child. They're given to the opposite sex. So, and the way the conversation goes with a 3rd or 4th grader with a boy is, Johnny, a lot of your classmates are telling us they're girls. So you might want to wear the pronoun pin that says she or he, she or her. And Johnny, quite naturally, being a 3rd or 4th grader, is just kind of like, oh, well, okay, the rest of my classmates are doing it. Maybe I am a girl. And the same thing goes for the girls. They're trying to transform them into boys. The reason they focus on girls in particular, the boys are not having an easy time of it, but the reason they focus on the girls is because this is what Karl Marx and Saul Alinsky, in their sick, twisted imaginations, had in mind for destroying the family unit. If you can prevent young girls from wanting to have families or having the ability to have families, which is what the transgender puberty blockers and the transgender surgical mutilations do, then you're not going to have as many children. You're not going to have as many happy family units. You're going to have not as many families going to church and praising God and Jesus and reading the Bible and praying. And that's what they're after. Right. They want fewer and fewer of those people, and they want more godless heathens.
The state will raise you and you will be happy. That's the idea.
That's right.
There.
That's right. It's the old World Economic Forum Klaus Schwab statement. And it's also, as you look, so one of the reasons I'm so happy to be on with you and your organization is that, it's Restoration America is one of a few that are really focusing on restoring America. And if you agree with me, if you think like me that where America really went wrong was when we started to allow the Marxist left and the people who have hated America all along through their generations of their ancestors to eliminate God from the public square, eliminate Jesus, eliminate the Torah if you're Jewish. We live in a Judeo-Christian society. Eliminate prayer and all these things from the government, the town square, from our institutions, the schools, and the government offices. That's where we went wrong. We allowed that to happen. And then at one point, I remember this clearly in the 60s or 70s, the conversation was about, oh, all this teenage pregnancy, all the young girls are getting pregnant. Well, that was a complete lie and completely manufactured. Not that there weren't some young girls getting pregnant, there were, but it wasn't a disaster. And so they took that big lie and turned it into, we've got to teach your children about sex education in our schools. And that's where we really dropped the ball. We should have all said, what could possibly go wrong with that? Absolutely not. You're not teaching our children about sex, and you're not giving our children your warped information about sex. So, all of these things started decades ago, and we should have stood up and fought and said, hell no, then. But now that we've found ourselves in this position of living in this completely rotten and insane world, we really have to inject God and Jesus and the Bible and prayer and regular religious worship back into our society. It's really the only way to change things.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's easy to trace, too, a lot of the people who are responsible for administering our schools are professors, both universities, elementary, all the way through high school. These are the old hippies who dropped out in the 60s and 70s and dropped back in later, got their PhD, and now they're running the school system. They are the man. But you could even trace it further back to that, right? I mean, if you go all the way back to the beginning of public education as we know it today, about 100 years ago, turn of the last century, so a little longer than that, you can even see this, system, this scheme by social engineering socialists on the left and progressive on the left to basically start that deconstruction of the family that you talked about earlier, with the idea of reprogramming people to be the progressive Superman, live in this utopia. What do you think of that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think that this is a gigantic experiment, this whole the idea of public schools. Like, it's the New Deal, but it goes back long before FDR. And it's part and parcel of the idea that the government's going to take care of all of us. And it just, I mean, what better teacher is there for a child than their mother? There's no better teacher.
That's right.
Naturally. And so the idea that some person who doesn't really know your child is going to come in and give them books and tell them history and explain to them the new math, and that math is sexist, and geography, and all these kinds of distortions that children are getting, if they're getting any teaching at all, is bizarre. So after the last year of storming the school boards in my hometown of Asheville, North Carolina, which is really the belly of the beast, I've completely given up on changing our public school systems. I think the only thing now is to, and the mothers are aware, they're activated. I was at some Moms for America events recently, and they're very on top of this. They're pulling their kids out of schools left and right. So moms, mama bears, grandma bears, granddad bears, pull your kids out of these public schools. You may say, what am I going to do with them? I'm working 3 jobs if you're a single mom. I really, really resonate with that, and that really concerns me. That's why it's so important that we develop a widespread and efficient homeschooling program. And lots of moms are finding that they didn't think they could homeschool their kids, but then they get part of a bigger community in their neighborhood, and they get 30 moms together or more, and then each mom agrees to take all the kids for 1 day a month. And so there are all these kinds of innovative ways of expanding homeschooling. Then, of course, you've got charter schools, school vouchers, you've got private schools, you've got, there's all kinds of ways you can pull your kid out of these dungeons of disaster. I mean, it's really hurting our kids. And recently, we've had 7 suicides in the Asheville area in less than 5 months, and they've all been of Christian conservative girls. So that's their end game. If these girls won't announce themselves to be lesbians or announce that they're transgender and start meeting with the school counselor about going to a therapist without their parents' knowledge and having the puberty blockers prescribed for them to start the process of their gender mutilation, then the school boards really have sanctioned two forms of militias. One is roaming hordes of trans queer girls who dominate the classroom, dominate the lunchroom, dominate the hallways and the gym. And they're constantly saying, you need to declare, you're either a homophobe or a transphobe if you won't declare yourself a lesbian or a transgender. And if you don't convert, we'll start with beating you senseless and leaving you out back by the dumpster. And then we'll proceed on to constantly bombarding you with texts and social media saying you better kill yourself. And it's working. So I've coined this term, the suicide bullies, and they exist.
Well, and convert is the right word. This is a religious cult we're talking about. I mean, militant secularism is not a neutral position. It's a full-fledged religion that's trying to push out the historic Christian teaching that this country was founded on, pluralism too, but all these different ideas that we take for granted. We've slowly watched prayer get pushed out of the public schools. That was in the 1950s. People think that was something that happened recently. It happened right after the end of World War II, supposedly in one of our great golden ages. One of the things that stands out to me from your recent work, just how bad the media is reporting on this. So you talked about transgender suicide rates in North Carolina. In every one of these instances, from what I can tell, the common denominator here is government schools, public schools. And yet the media reports it as repressive Christian parenting or the COVID lockdowns or not allowing your child to express his actual gender identity. How biased are these people really, Bill?
Well, so they continue to claim that the suicides are of trans queer children who are struggling and who are being bullied. That has not been happening over the last years. It's been completely flipped. It used to happen. Homosexual children were bullied and, sometimes to death. But that was years ago. Now they've flipped it so that the Christian conservative children are being bullied for their principles. So one of the worst things you can be in a public school is a Trump supporter, because they identify you. You have a big target on your back. Also, if you're wearing a shirt that says prayer or has a picture of Jesus on it or something, they immediately force you to take it off. And we'll take a girl, for instance, who has a shirt with prayer on it. They'll say, come with me. You have to take that shirt off without contacting the parent. Then they take them to some creepy room where there's a bunch of clothes, leftover clothes or secondhand clothes on the floor, and then force them to change their shirt. I mean, this is Stalinist. This is not even Stalin wouldn't come up with something so awful. But I mean, the whole thing goes back to, I'm afraid it all started with Thomas Jefferson and his letter to the Danbury Baptists. This started the ball rolling in some pretty evil people's minds that there had to be a separation of church and state. There was never a separation of church and state. It's nowhere in the Constitution. And these people are just lying. Every time you hear somebody say that, just say, shake your head and walk away muttering about what evil people they are. Because if you buy into that, you buy into everything else that's going on in our public schools. That results.
Well, let me point out too, the idea, the separation of church and state, most people don't understand what it means, right? That phrase, it goes back further than Thomas Jefferson. It was actually coined by a Calvinist Puritan, Roger Winthrop, who's the first Baptist in America, founder of Rhode Island. And what he mentioned was God has created different spheres of government. You have secular government over here. You have church government. You have the family. These are all legitimate spheres with their own things. So, for instance, to bring it back to education, if government's responsible for executing criminals, would you really hand education of your kids over to the guy who's holding the sword over the criminal's neck? I don't think so, right? I mean, people think
you certainly would.
Right. Separation of church and state does not mean pulling God out of state. We've always recognized in this country that the God who created everything, the Trinitarian God, is the God above the United States and the God above all countries. This is what Christ as Lord actually means, this classic phrase of Christendom going back 2,000 plus years. But trying to warp that language into, well, we can't have any religious influence in the government. It's just a sneaky way of putting secular thought into it, isn't it?
It is. And I think, if I were to try to modify, or I could have a conversation with Thomas Jefferson, I think what he was really trying to say was, hey, look, me and my gang, George Washington and Ben Franklin, all the founders of this country, were very faithful and devout men. And we started this country in the likeness of God and with the full authority of God and support of God. And what that letter to the Danbury Baptists meant, far be it from me to translate Thomas Jefferson, but I got to say, I think what he was saying was, we're not worried about religion creeping into the operations of the state. We're worried about the state creeping into the churches and into the houses of worship.
That's
and of
right.
course, these days, what we see now is a complete infiltration. There's a horribly scary book about the infiltration of the churches. And we've seen it time and time again. They're infiltrating everything that's good on this planet. And so, they're infiltrating. I wrote an article about the Boy Scouts and the way the homosexual monolith, infiltrated them. So I remember clearly it all started in the 70s and 80s, and it was lawsuits galore against the Boy Scouts. We must have we must have gay troop masters. And they sued them and sued them and sued them until finally they gave in and said, okay, we're going to have gay troop masters. And I thought, oh boy, how can this go wrong? Well, then we had 20, 30 years of sexual abuse of our Boy Scout children. And now the Boy Scouts are being sued for the sexual abuse of the Boy Scouts themselves. So now they're being dragged into bankruptcy, which of course was the whole point of the exercise. This infiltration, it's not just an infiltration to find out what we're thinking or what we're talking about. It's an infiltration to destroy these institutions. The Boy Scouts was a 110-year-old, now 114-year-old institution that produced many presidents and astronauts. This was an important part. It was a Christian organization. This was an important part of our society, and they've ruined it. So I say hashtag Democrats ruin everything.
Well, let's talk about this massive, can we call it a great awakening related to homeschools? There's the number of households that are now homeschooling their kids, pulled their kids out of government schools since 2020 has exploded. I don't know the latest numbers, but I know it was doubled each year or thereabouts in the last 4 years now. But I think people need to understand, too, when they're thinking about these issues and they're asking themselves, is it time to pull my kid out of that public school we've been sending him to for years? Understand that it's not really about living in the right communities for most people. Let's go to Texas for a minute. I know you recently interviewed Angela Paxton, the wife of Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. She points out that even in a ruby red conservative state where you'd think at least Texas would get education right, you find children's school books in these schools with obscene graphic sex talking about transgender identity. It's not really about where you live. It's about what you teach and whether you as a parent take that God-given authority to raise your children properly. Is that right, Bill?
Yes. Angela Paxton was, for me, a monumental interview, perhaps one of the best I've ever had in my 30 years of media work. She takes the term mama and grandma bear to a whole new level. She's really quite an erudite, just a powerful spokeswoman for protecting your children. And the highlight of that interview was something I very much wanted to get her on tape with, which was the flashlight story. And it was a tremendous metaphorical story about how a guide took her and her husband, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, through the jungle and would stop and point a flashlight and say, this is one of the most poisonous predators in the world. And, and then say, stay behind me. And, everybody would stay behind him and they'd walk along and there's another one. And so she made the metaphor to mothers making sure they help their children avoid predators, and they are all over the place out there, from Sound of Freedom type sex trafficking to the type of sexual abuse that is still going on in our schools constantly. And then moms shining this flashlight into the shadows for their children, into the shadows of schools. And it's a powerful metaphor. And I think that, in Texas and Florida, I call them the salvation states, because without these states, this country would be disintegrating even faster. And what's going on down there, everybody in Florida and Texas is worried to death about it, is these people are coming in and just voting for the same rotten governmental officials that they voted for in California or wherever they came from, Illinois or New York. So this is happening all over the country. This just isn't happening here, but there is hope. And the homeschooling phenomenon is something that is going to be increasingly important. For instance, at Liberty University, the vice provost is a guy named Dave Bratt, a former congressman. He's a friend of mine, and he's now kind of making sure that Liberty University makes the right moves for the future. Liberty has a K through 12 homeschooling program that's done online. This can be very helpful to a single mom with a couple of jobs, or the mom who might have been an artist and has no idea how to educate her children, because they'll help educate the children with a cafeteria style offering and help them with online, while the mom can help them with ethical things and with some of the arts and the letters and humanity, whatever the mom's capabilities are. So that's a really good program. They have 17,000 children in it currently in their K through 12 homeschooling. And I think the more, probably we'll see an offering from Highland University if they don't have one already, and High Point, and all of the good kind of Christian-based and foundational schools. So that's a great thing. But I mean, in terms of pulling your kids out of these schools because they're in danger. In North Carolina here, I heard a great statistic that gives hope. In 2022, there were 97% of all children went to public schools in the state of North Carolina. That's in 2022. By last year, in 2023, it was down to 87%. That's a shocking drop of 10%. That means mothers, fathers, uncles, all kinds of parental persons are pulling these kids out of their schools, and you've got to do it, because I can assure you that the children aren't learning anything in the schools. They're not getting homework anymore. Frequently, the classrooms have no books in them. The children are standing around on their phones and not seated, not going through any kind of organized lesson. The teachers are filing their nails. And then there's also an insidious thing called CNN 10. I don't know if you're familiar with it. CNN 10 is a special program. It's kind of kept under wraps, as it should be. CNN 10 is a series of 10-minute little films for our children. And what they do is they go in and they talk about how great critical race theory is, and how a little white boy should be ashamed of the color of his skin, and about how a little black girl should feel oppressed and like she can never go anywhere no matter how hard she works. This is awful, evil stuff. And then they, of course, go into the trans queer things with other 10-minute segments. The teachers are actually wheeling the TV into the classroom, turning it on, and then going and taking a nice nap after lunch in the teacher's lounge. This is what's happening, and it's being reported time and time again. So, but there's good news, but we got to keep fighting. You've got people like Pastor John Amanchukwu, who's a very large black guy with a big beard and very intimidating. He goes in and yells at these school boards. I'm doing the same thing. And he's achieved national recognition for it and been on Fox News quite a bit for it and written a book about it. And so it's people like that. And Michelle Morrow here in North Carolina is a homeschooling mom and a really devoutly Christian woman who has already beaten the rhino that was in the North Carolina Superintendent of Schools slot in the primary. So she got rid of her. And then now she's running against a real monster of a man, Mo Green, in a Maybe it's Mo Davis. I'm terribly sorry about his last name. I don't have that right. But she's got to win this and to become the North Carolina superintendent of schools and clean up our schools. People have to continue to fight. And that's why it's so important. Moms for America and Moms for Liberty, keep up the fight, keep storming the school boards. We should have never stopped storming these school boards after the 2020 Loudoun County, Virginia miracle, when they flipped 15 school boards and Governor Glenn Youngkin rode that crest of a wave into the governor's mansion. We need to do that in many, many states.
Well, and let's talk about, let's stay in North Carolina for a minute, but Loudoun County here in Virginia, I think one day people are going to see that as our Battle of Bunker Hill, this big turning point that gives hope nationwide that, wow, we patriots can really do this. But let's talk about North Carolina. There's a story that's blowing up in the last couple of months. My organization has been part of unveiling some of this, and it's about North Carolina's Parents' Bill of Rights. This is a huge piece of legislation. I should talk about a little bit of the background because the Democrat governor, Roy Cooper, actually vetoed this Bill of Rights for giving parents protections over their kids in schools last year. It only passed because the Republican legislature overrode his veto. Bill, tell us about what's so important about this legislation, the protections in here.
Well, it's so important that we shouldn't have to pass anything like it because it's so obvious. But we had to pass something. We had to pass something like that. And I think the real problem, Michelle Morrow, incidentally, was very involved in that in the legislation. She's just a top-notch lady. But she herself admits the problem is in enforcement. There need to be some really strong penalties, including serious jail time and maximum security prison facilities for people who violate this. School board members, teachers, assistant principals and principals, the counselors are violating this all the time. Even the librarians are distributing these books. It used to be in my day, librarians were these bespectacled, nice, wonderful old ladies who would introduce us to books like, The Little Engine That Could and Where the Wild Things Are and Goodnight Moon. No, that's all gone now. It's all about, the really bad books that are exposing our children and forcing them to grow up too fast. The parental rights bill in North Carolina, I would like to see it passed in every state. I'd like to see a federal law, actually, because these people don't fear any local state laws or county laws, certainly, because the courts are corrupt and the law enforcement's corrupt. So they've been violating FCC rules, which is something that Moms for America wants to clamp down on. If, in other words, you can't give a child a book when that same language wouldn't be allowed on radio or TV. That's a good legal point, but you can't get a sheriff to arrest anybody for that. You also can't get a sheriff to arrest, provided they're of the same woke, godless ilk that the school boards and the school administrations are. You can't get them to arrest anybody for the numerous laws on the book against distributing and disseminating obscene material to children. That's a very serious crime. And so the reason the Parental Bill of Rights is necessary is because over the last decade or so, perhaps even longer, they've established this pedophile secrecy in the schools. Don't tell your mom, don't tell your dad. It starts with the pedophile with the pronoun pins. And so you asked about the pins and what they said. So they get Johnny to wear a pin that says he, her are my pronouns, and he clips it to his collar or the shirt. And then he walks around all day with it, and they march around like little mixed up people with their totally wrong pronoun pins. And then shortly before the final bell rings, the teachers and the principals, everybody comes around and says, okay, now give us your pins and we'll save them for tomorrow. Please don't tell your parents about this because they won't love you anymore. They'll be very upset with you if they know about this. Right out of the pedophile playbook. These people they know that it's almost impossible to stop them. They continue going on. And I mean, it's hard to foresee any way of stopping them short of a very long prison sentence or I don't know what else. I mean, it's just they've got to be stopped. And the Parental Bill of Rights is so important that I think a federal one would be what's called for. And I have no doubt that should President Trump get in for a second term, he'll go down that path. He's been talking a lot recently about defunding public schools that are involved in this trans queer insanity and teaching CRT. He's been saying that at his rallies. And so I believe that's something that's very near and dear to him on his list. Those of us that have children, and even those of us that don't have children, should be very on top of this, because this is the future of humanity. And, so President Trump, he's famous for loving his children and his grandchildren, as most sane and rational parents do. And so right. I think that this is going to be one of his early things. He's going to start digging for coal and get rid of the environmental nonsense. Yes, he's going to close the border. Yes, he's going to work on the economy. But I think this is right up there. So I'm just looking forward to the time when we can have some really enforceable jail time, when some of these school board lunatics are dragged out in handcuffs and leg shackles.
Well, in a sea of important issues, this may be the most definitive important issue of our time. Bill, we could talk all day, but tell us real fast, where can people follow you?
People can follow me on almost any social media at Relentless Bill, Facebook, Twitter, True Social, Instagram, all of the Gab, Telegraph. All of the social media, they can follow me there. But what I really want people to do, and moms and dads, and even aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters, just anybody who has a small child that they love who's in a public school, go and sit in the school board meetings and just listen. I don't ask you to get up and yell at the school board or rant and rave at them or accuse them of things like I do. I'm not asking them to get arrested. We're working towards a point in this country where people are going to be widespread arrested at these school board meetings, and that will change things radically. But I want parents and people who have small children, small loved ones in public schools, to go to these meetings and just listen and see if you think these people aren't up to something really satanic. They are. So go and get involved, because they've completely eliminated the PTA, sitting down with your children's teachers. These things don't happen anymore, because I'll tell you what, more likely than not, your child's public school teacher has green hair, a double pierced nose, and a tattoo on their neck. And I can tell you that there's no good teacher that looks like that.
Yeah, that's right. Time to tune in, folks. Well, Bill Robinson, thank you for joining the show. We really appreciate your time and all the work you're doing.
Thank you for having me, sir. All the best.
And thank you, folks, for tuning in and supporting conservative voices like Bill's, working to expose the truth about the rot spreading through this once great country. Remember that it's only by working together and by praying together that we can restore the United States of America to greatness under Almighty and Sovereign God. I'm Hayden Ludwig. Join us next time as the battle rages on.
First Right, a new kind of news summary without the liberal slant. Every morning, in your inbox, always free. Subscribe by texting First Right to 30161. That's First Right, all caps, one word, to 30161.